Right, let's talk about this M2 controversy. Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. This is not a normal video, as you can probably tell. Things look a bit different, and also this is just a reaction video to a piece of tech news, or two pieces of tech news to be exact, that have really bothered me. Also, please ignore I can't sugarcoat this at all. It's baby sick. I'm a new dad. This stuff happens. I didn't realize this was on my t-shirt. Sorry. So there's two things to talk about, and they both relate to the M2 chip, which at the moment is available in the 13-inch MacBook Pro, which is a weird product, but that's for another topic, but is also coming to the new MacBook Air, which we hope is going to be available for pre-order at the end of this week or potentially next week. But there have been two pieces of tech news that have made me fire up the studio and sit in front of this mic unusually today. The first thing is, and firstly, I'm not going to mention the people involved, the people that have been doing these tests and these reports, because it's not fair to point fingers. I just want to comment on the news that it has generated, really, because it's bothered me. And more importantly, I think if you're waiting to buy one of these M2 machines, let's be honest, probably the MacBook Air, probably not the 13-inch MacBook Pro, but if you're waiting to buy one of these machines and you're getting wind of these reports about the M2 chip, you're probably now thinking twice, and I think that's a bad idea. So the first thing is this stuff around the SSD, the storage in the 13-inch MacBook Pro. The reports basically are that the 256GB version of the 13-inch M2 MacBook Pro is slower. So basically the read and write speeds for the storage in that computer are slower than the M1 version that it's replacing. Now, the stats and the tests and the benchmarks prove this to be the case. It is slower, and it's slower by quite a bit, actually. And on the face of it, that is worrying. Totally agree. However, it does only apply to that 256GB version of the 13-inch M2 MacBook Pro. If you go up to the 512 and beyond, it looks like the speeds are about the same as the M1 version. So why the fuss? I maintain that the people who buy that 256GB version probably aren't going to be too worried about the speeds that that thing produces for the SSD. They probably don't even know what the speeds are or how they compare to the previous version. The second thing is slightly more worrying if you look at it at face value, and this is about the apparent throttling that is happening on the M2 chip in that 13-inch MacBook Pro. And this comes after a bunch of benchmark tests that were done by a certain YouTube channel. I won't mention them, like I say, but you probably know who they are if you're watching this video. And they demonstrated that during a Final Cut Pro export, the M2 MacBook Pro was running its fans at full chat, full speed, completely, blasting the things to death, and as a consequence it was having to reduce the power coming out of that M2 chip. And they compared that performance with the M1 chip of roughly the same spec, and it didn't do the same thing. It basically maintained its power much more efficiently, and the net result of that was a quicker export time for the M1 version of the MacBook Pro versus the M2 version. Now, that's not right at all. If you look at that again at face value, this is bad news for Apple, isn't it? Because their older version of their MacBook is outperforming the newer version. However, those tests were done with 8K raw Canon footage. Now, if you don't care about video, if it's not your thing, basically that is very high resolution, very chunky footage out of pretty much a professional camera. And I'm sorry, but most people who buy that 13-inch MacBook Pro are not going to be working with footage like that. Now, yeah, during the M2 launch at WWDC last month, Apple did claim that the M2 chip is capable of working with 8K footage. So this is a completely legitimate test. I have no problem with that whatsoever. But again, how many buyers of that M2 chip in either the 13-inch MacBook Pro or the forthcoming MacBook Air are going to be working with 8K raw footage? I don't think very many at all. And the problem with this and the SSD thing that I mentioned earlier is that as soon as this stuff gets into the hands of the mass media, all hell breaks loose. And it's a little bit unfair, not on Apple. I'm not an Apple apologist at all. If you watch this channel, you'll know that I do have issues with Apple, and I will not be backwards in coming forwards if I think they've done something ridiculous, which happens quite often. As I mentioned earlier, regular consumers will not be thinking about SSD speeds, and they won't be working with 8K raw footage. And more importantly, they won't be looking at the clock when it comes to doing video edits and video exports. Very few people, if any, who buy these first two M2 machines will have those kind of time constraints when it comes to production work. Now, if you're a YouTuber or if you're running a video production house, you do have those time constraints. And it's important that the machines that you use can export things quickly, render stuff quickly. And yeah, 100%, it would be an absolute nightmare if the new machine you've bought with the brand new chip is slower than the old one. However, benchmarks are just one part of the story. And again, Apple has done something strange here. They've kind of reduced the speed and the ability for the M2 chip to remain cool compared to the M1 version, 100%. But what I'm personally far more interested in is how these machines feel. I've always said that. It's the reason I started this channel. I don't enjoy benchmarks. I have better things to be doing personally than to be sat there looking at numbers. What's more important to me is how these things feel. And the M1 chip, so the M1 in this M1 MacBook Air, is amazing. This is the 8GB base model version of the M1 MacBook Air, and it's been the best laptop I have ever owned. And the main reason for that is that it is completely effortless. Honestly, you can just get everything done on this. And I've even done 4K video edits on this without any issue whatsoever. It slows down a little bit, as you'd expect, but given the spec, that's going to happen, isn't it? But apart from that, 98% of the work that I do on this machine, it just flies through. And my suspicion with these new M2 machines is that they will feel exactly the same if you are a normal user like me, like I am, with this particular laptop. If you're just doing regular stuff on the M2 MacBook Pro or the M2 MacBook Air, you're not going to sit there thinking, oh dear, the SSD's a bit slow, or oh no, why is it throttling the performance? You just won't notice. But again, coming back to the mass media and the way they pick up on some of these benchmark, hyperbolic headlines, is that they kind of misconstrue them and then paint this picture of a laptop or a machine that is worse than its predecessor. You know, you can imagine the headlines. It's going to be M2 chip is worse than M1 chip, or M2 chip proven to overheat. If you're a regular consumer and you hear that, you're going to think, whoa, hang on a minute, I'm not going to buy this computer. There's something seriously wrong here. And as someone who speaks for the consumer with this sort of stuff, that really bothers me, because I do think the M2 MacBook Air and even the M2 13-inch MacBook, no, forget that one. The M2 MacBook Air is a solid purchase. If you are a normal user, like I am with this laptop, that laptop will be a fantastic buy for you. And I'd hate these headlines to put you off. Now, if these benchmarks related to the M2 Pro or the M2 Max, whenever we see those chips, if we see those chips, then that is a completely different thing, because this kind of benchmarking, which looks at multi-core performance and very intensive workloads, is completely relevant to those chips. And as someone who owns and runs the 16-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Max chip in it, if I then found out that the next version of that laptop was actually noticeably slower and had a slower SSD, I would be pretty angry about it. But that's only because that is relevant to that type of computer. That computer is made for that type of work. These initial M2 chips aren't. So if off the back of these kind of reports of poor performance with the M2 chip, if you're still wondering if you should buy an M2 MacBook Air or even that 13-inch MacBook Pro, then please don't be put off. There's a reason you want that laptop, and I can guarantee it will be a great buy. And to clarify, I'm not saying stop doing those benchmarks and stop doing that kind of reporting. Please do it. It's an important part of this industry, but just be a little bit less, just chill out about it. Tell us what you think, you know, what these results are, but just peg back a little bit on the kind of clickbait and the capital letters everywhere. Tell us what you think, tell us what you found, and let people make their own decision. Don't try and force this kind of narrative that the M2 chip is a complete waste of time, when for most people who are going to buy these initial machines, that isn't the case. As you'd guess, I'm going to be doing lots of M2 based content on this channel over the next few months. My M2 MacBook Air will be with me relatively soon, hopefully. Tomorrow though, I've got another video about how to choose between the M1 and the M2 MacBook Air. Regardless of these reports of poor performance of the M2, that video is still relevant. I'm obviously going to say that. But if you don't want to miss that, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell. And thanks for watching this one, guys. Keep watching for a link to another M2 based video above, and I'll catch you next time. Cheers.